The United States is still relying on this tanker aircraft from the 1950s in 2025. If this thing was truly outdated, it would have been gone decades ago. But now that even France has retired it, what's the hidden reason the U.S. Air Force will not let it die? Let's start with the one thing a lot of people don't know about the Boeing KC-135 Stratotanker. Did it survive so far because the Air Force got nostalgic and couldn't let go? Nope. It survived because it's the quiet engine behind almost everything the U.S. does in the air. Fighters, bombers, surveillance birds, rescue missions, carrier aviation, coalition strike packages where 5 countries are all running the same plan. None of that scales globally unless someone is moving fuel to the exact place, at the exact time the whole operation depends on. And that someone is usually a tanker, usually a KC-135. Because once a military builds its rhythm around aerial refueling, you don't just swap the aircraft. You're messing with routes, timing, training, basing, basically the entire choreography of how air power moves across the map. So let me ask you, if you pull the one piece everything else leans on, what snaps first? Now, the origin story is where the trap starts to make sense. The KC-135 comes from Boeing's 367-80, the same prototype that helped lead to the commercial 707. But this one was designed for military needs right from the beginning. The first one flew in August 1956. The first production Stratotanker arrived in June 1957, and the Air Force got its last KC-135 delivery in 1965. That timing matters, because this wasn't a tiny side project that could be swapped out later. It grew into a national refueling system. At its peak, the Air Force built a 732 aircraft world around it, training pipelines, depot routines, bases, backup plans, the whole machine, assuming tankers would always be there like oxygen. And a huge chunk of that capability sits in the Guard and Reserve, where the people, the parts, and the procedures are built around tankers on call. So when someone says, "Why not retire it already?" the real question is, are you ready to rebuild all of that from zero? And what did the Air Force get for that investment? A big, steady workhorse that can refuel jets in midair and still carry people or cargo when the mission needs it. 4 turbofans under those 35-degree swept wings, built to take off at up to 322,500 pounds. A cargo deck above the refueling gear so it can carry mixed loads, up to 83,000 pounds of cargo, depending on how it's set up. That's the real advantage of a tanker. It doesn't need to be flashy. It needs to be reliable. It needs to show up when the plan says it will. It needs enough fuel and enough flexibility that commanders can build entire operations around it. So if the whole air war depends on the boring plane being on time, is it actually boring? And then there's the fuel handoff, because this part looks calm until you really think about what's happening. The KC-135 can push almost all its internal fuel through that long flying boom, and it's not automatic. There's a boom operator in the back doing something that's basically precision work at altitude. While 2 aircraft fly close enough to make your instincts scream, nope. And somehow it still works, because this isn't just metal and switches. It's a skill that's been sharpened over years. What's interesting is that the KC-135 doesn't play favorites. Not everyone refuels the same way, so it brings options. When a receiver needs probe and drogue, it can support that too, because plenty of partner nations, plus a lot of Navy and NATO aircraft, aren't built for a boom-only world. And if you really want to see it flex, some jets get the multi-point refueling system, pods on the wingtips that let the tanker service 2 aircraft at once. Think of it this way: a whole formation trying to cross an ocean, a schedule that can't slip, and the KC-135 acting like the pit crew that keeps the convoy moving. How do you replace something that doesn't just refuel planes? It controls the tempo of the mission. Now, here's where people mess up the story. They look at the age and assume the KC-135 is still around because the Air Force got stuck in the past. Nope. It stayed relevant because it didn't stay the same. Hundreds of KC-135As were re-engined with CFM56s, creating the KC-135R and KC-135T, an upgrade that shifted the platform's value, not just its sound. More fuel to offload, better efficiency, lower operating costs, and dramatically less noise than the original A model. That's not a facelift. That's the kind of change that turns old into still annoyingly useful. So ask yourself, when does a design stop being outdated and start being upgraded? There was another path too, the KC-135E, fitted with TF33PW102 engines, but that era is over. The last KC-135E retired in 2009. What remains at the core is the R and T force, and those aircraft keep getting refreshed because the mission keeps demanding it. And this is where global reach stops sounding like a slogan and starts sounding like a requirement you have to pay for. The KC-135 doesn't only back Air Force jets, it supports Navy and Marine aircraft too, and it supports allied nations, because U.S. airpower almost never shows up alone. Plus, it's not just a flying gas station, it can haul passengers and cargo, and it can pivot into aeromedical evacuation with patient support pallets for litter and walking patients. Meaning, the same aircraft that extends combat range can also move people when the plan goes sideways. When things get messy, and they always do, what do you want in your toolbox? Something delicate and specialized, or something that can bend without breaking? And if you think that's just talk, here's proof it's real. In July 2025, when major flooding hit parts of the Philippines after multiple cyclones, reporting described a U.S. KC-135 deploying toward Clark Air Base, carrying humanitarian assistance and disaster response equipment. Philippine Air Force officials were publicly talking about the incoming support while keeping their own air assets ready. That's the KC-135's weird superpower. One week it's extending fighters over water, the next it's showing up with gear that makes "help is coming" feel physical. When a runway becomes the difference between chaos and control, who do you call? And then there's France, because France basically ran the "just retire it" experiment everyone assumes the US can do overnight. In late June 2025, the French Air and Space Force retired its last KC-135s and handed the tanker transport mission to the A330MRTT Phoenix, complete with the final flypast and the end of an era vibe. But that's the key detail. They could do it cleanly because their fleet was small enough to swap in one sweep. The US isn't swapping a chapter, it's managing refueling capacity at national scale. And if the KC-135 were truly on borrowed time, the Air Force would treat it like a museum piece with a checklist. Instead, it gets upgraded like something expected to keep working. The fleet's been going through Block 45 cockpit upgrades, adding more glass cockpit capability for engine instrumentation, a radar altimeter, an advanced autopilot, and a modern flight director on top of the Pacer Crag Foundation. That isn't cool screens. That's reduced workload, tighter precision, and more consistent operations across an aircraft family that has to perform everywhere, all the time. If it was supposed to be done soon, why invest like it has more missions waiting? And now we hit the part that feels almost unfair. Because even in the era of stealth and hypersonics, the KC-135 is creeping into a role people don't associate with old tankers at all: connectivity. The Air Force has been pushing to make big, non-stealth aircraft more survivable and more useful in contested environments. And one of the clearest moves is turning them into smarter nodes. There have been demonstrations where modified underwing pods, hardware normally meant for refueling, were packed with data links and networking gear so the KC-135 can help pass information between forces in real time. And in the Pacific, this wasn't just theory. During Resolute Force Pacific 25, reporting described a KC-135 test detachment evaluating gateway-style connectivity that fused multiple line-of-sight tactical data link networks with beyond line-of-sight connections to link joint and coalition partners. Translation: When networks don't naturally talk to each other, the tanker can help act like the bridge. And that matters because tankers don't just pass through the flow of an operation, they orbit, they stay on station. So if you make the aircraft that's already there smarter, you quietly upgrade the whole system. But none of that matters if you can't keep the tanker alive long enough to do the mission. Threat systems keep getting longer range and nastier, which makes the first rule brutally simple. If you can't understand what's around you, you can't choose smart orbits, safe routes, or the right timing. That's why the conversation isn't only about networking. It's also drifting toward modular, podded self-protection concepts, bolt-on paths that can help high-value aircraft operate more safely without rebuilding the entire fleet from scratch. In other words, don't wait for a perfect future tanker. Harden the one doing the job right now. Now, zoom out, and you hit the procurement reality that locks the KC-135 in place. The replacement plan has been messy. New tankers arrive, but not fast enough to make the old backbone vanish, and the transition has been slowed by real-world problems that force the Air Force to keep a safety net. Because you can't retire the insurance policy while the replacement is still fighting Category 1 problems, especially problems tied to the refueling process itself, like how the boom operator sees and controls contact in real conditions. The result is the same every time. The just replace it fantasy faceplants. So what do you do when the future keeps showing up late? Now layer in the other roster, hit the KC-10 extender. The big high-volume gas hauler didn't stay around forever as a hedge. It's been phased out and retired from U.S. service. And that doesn't just remove a platform, it removes breathing room. So until replacements show up at scale, the burden shifts harder onto what's left. And even as newer tankers come in, demand doesn't politely shrink. It grows as operations spread out and distance becomes the point. Retire too many too fast and the pain isn't theoretical. It shows up as missions that can't be supported, training that gets squeezed, and war plans that suddenly need rewriting. That's why retirements get political. Why cuts have to be managed carefully, and why you keep hearing bridge talk while next-gen concepts crawl through longer timelines. Because when air power depends on fuel in the sky, who's brave enough to gamble on being short? Here's the thing people don't expect. The KC-135 isn't just still around. It's still being sold as a capability because the world still needs what it does. In 2025, a commercial refueling company called Maitreya was getting a KC-135 ready to head to India under a contract for tanker flight hours using an ex-French Air Force jet to support training and operational refueling while India works through a modernization gap. Think about that for a second. If this aircraft was truly a museum piece, why is someone flying it halfway across the planet as a paid solution? What does that tell you about how rare mid-air gas stations really are? Here's the part people always underestimate. This kind of longevity isn't luck. It's maintenance. Old doesn't mean done. It means the jet is being kept alive on purpose, like a system that gets serviced on schedule. The KC-135 survives because it lives in a non-stop routine, serious inspections, depot time, structural checks, parts swaps, avionics updates, the unglamorous work that keeps it safe and reliable. And when the crews have worked on the same airframe for decades, they don't figure it out anymore. They know it. That kind of familiarity is a weapon. You know how the newest thing is always exciting, but the old proven thing is the one that actually shows up? And here's the sneaky bonus that makes the KC-135 family even harder to push aside. It's not a one-job platform. The wider C-135 family has done plenty beyond refueling, recon versions, test programs, weird specialized missions where you need a proven jet with room to adapt. That matters because it shows the mindset. The Air Force doesn't treat this family like a disposable tool. It treats it like a strong base you can keep reshaping when new needs pop up. And if a platform can keep taking on new roles, how do you replace it in one clean step? So when someone shrugs and says, "It's old," why not retire it? The answer is annoyingly simple. Because it still does the things that matter. It can move a lot of fuel, work with different refueling setups, support U.S. missions with partners, and keep getting upgrades so it fits how modern operations run. Age is just a fact. Capability is the whole decision, and that's the bottom line. The KC-135 is still flying because it still holds up the idea of American reach, helping coalitions, stretching distance, staying useful through upgrades, and quietly getting tougher and smarter as the threat environment gets uglier. So next time you see a KC-135 lumbering across the sky and think, why is that dinosaur still up there? Ask yourself a better question. What stops working the second it doesn't? Because it's not just carrying fuel. It's carrying the U.S. military's ability to show up anywhere on Earth and stay there long enough to matter. If breakdowns like this help you see past the headlines and into the weapons that might shape the next war, hit subscribe so you don't miss the next deep dive.